Welcome all. I know that a few are just still coming in, but hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Joe Bullough, Engagement and Partnerships Lead at the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today on behalf of the Oxford Education Deanery. Before we get started, I just want to share a couple of brief announcements. Firstly, just to say this webinar is being recorded today. You are welcome to switch off your video if you rather your video did not appear, although of course it's nice to see everyone. Secondly, I just want to give a brief shout out to the Deanery's range of research digests. Those are plain language summaries of research for use in practice, as well as our resource packs, podcasts on our site. I'll post the link in the chat, but please do have a browse. There's lots on there, and resource packs and digests related to sustainability on there as well. Yes, I'll post that in just a moment. That's all for me. Thank you all so much for joining today. And now it's my pleasure to pass you over to our host, the Deanery Sustainability Team, and Dr. Travis Fuchs.
Thanks so much, Joe. Really appreciate it. I think my camera just like automatically unfocused my face, so I'm gonna hope that comes back in a second. But hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Travis Fuchs, as Joe said. I'm joined today by Dr. Ann Keary as well as Alexis McGivern, and we're here to talk to a little bit today about understanding and resisting the fossil fuel industry in the science and geography curriculum. So we do have a slideshow, which I'll put in the chat right now, that we're going to use to walk through and actually record some of our information that we're going to share today, as well as some reflections. So that is an editable document. So don't try to sneak ahead right now and do anything too soon, but we will ask you to participate that at some point. Okay. So the kind of flow of today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the fossil fuel industry and its influence kind of writ large, as well as in classrooms. We're then going to talk about some features of what we're going to call petropedagogy that the fossil fuel industry uses. And then we'll get into some breakout rooms to try to discuss some of these in our classroom contexts. Sound good? I will hand it over to start us off to Ann.
Great. Thanks so much, Travis, and looking forward to our discussions in the breakout room. So I will kick us off. The big question, what is fossil fuel industry influence? So broadly speaking, fossil fuel industry influence concerns the power of fossil fuel companies to shape social narratives and political decisions in ways that will protect their profits. It's a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. It involves advertising, lobbying, the funding of think tanks, university research, sports, the arts, and education. And the fossil fuel industry uses its influence to maintain our dependence on their products, to undermine public understanding of the harms their products cause, particularly to our climate system, and to delay and obstruct government action. Next slide, please. So the origins of this fossil fuel industry influence campaign can be traced to the industry's response to growing public awareness of the threat of climate change and government moves to address that threat. So in 1988, the fact that the burning of fossil fuels was causing global warming became major news when NASA scientist Dr. James Hansen testified on the issue before the US Congress. And in that same year, with US government support, the UN established its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, in response to these developments, fossil fuel companies came together to establish the so-called Global Climate Coalition, but not with the goal of addressing climate change, but with the goal of opposing climate policies. Then in 1998, following the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first international agreement to reduce emissions, the coalition upped its game and under the leadership of the American Petroleum Institute, drafted a global climate science action plan. Next slide. As you can see, according to this memo, they believed victory would be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science, and recognition of uncertainties becomes part of conventional wisdom. And the memo actually goes on to outline their strategies. So to promote the false claim that climate science was uncertain, they proposed to recruit experts to dispute and contest climate science, lobby legislators, target the media, and significantly influence education. Next slide, Travis. So in the case of education, they proposed that a global science education task group be created as the point of outreach to the National Science Teachers Association, and that this group be charged with developing so-called educational materials. So the fact that in Canada today, in my own research, we found that there are at least 39 oil and gas companies involved in climate-related education. This has its origin in the development of this strategy in 1998. Next slide. Now, when the industry launched this campaign, they did so not because they thought the climate science was uncertain, quite the contrary. They knew it was well-founded. And they knew this because they had commissioned their own scientific studies. And their own scientists had repeatedly warned them that the research showed that the continued burning of fossil fuels would destabilize the Earth's climate systems with devastating impacts for humanity. Asked to brief the American Petroleum Institute itself, the climate scientist John Lauerman was clear. If fossil fuels continued to be used by 2005, global warming might be barely noticeable, but by the 2060s, it would have globally catastrophic effects. Yet rather than sharing this research, the industry doubled down on sowing doubt. Next slide. In choosing this course of action, the fossil fuel industry borrowed from the playbook of the tobacco industry. Indeed, big oil and big tobacco even use the same PR firms and the same tactics. And these tactics include associating their products with desirable values, freedom, independence, and even national identity, celebrating lifestyles associated with their products, and of course, obscuring the true harms their products cause, while, on occasion suggesting that if there was a problem, the industry was part of the solution. Now, looking at these ads, we read them now, knowing full well that smoking does indeed cause cancer, and we're reading them in the context of government action to restrict tobacco advertising, to educate the public about the health harms of smoking, and encouraging people to quit. We are not seeing similar government actions when it comes to the fossil fuel industry. But lessons from campaigns against tobacco show that education can be a powerful tool. Next slide. So we would not allow the tobacco industry to sponsor health education. We should not allow the fossil fuel industry to be involved in any way in environment or climate change education, or education at all, frankly. And the first step in pushing back against fossil fuel influence in education is understanding how it works. And I will now pass to Alexis.
Thanks so much, Anne. And just to highlight an example of where this is coming into the sphere that is not necessarily in a direct educational context, Travis, if you could go to the next slide. This is just an example of how the fossil fuel industry seeks to influence school children even outside of their curriculum in schools. So the energy giant Equinor, which is majority owned by the Norwegian government, developed a video game called Energy Town, which essentially challenges pupils to come up with what a town might look like in the year 2050. But what's interesting about this video game is that it's not just for entertainment, it's really selling the message that cities by the year 2050 will not be able to run without oil and gas. In fact, students who are working on this video game are told that renewable energy is not sufficient to power their virtual town, and that the only way that they can have a stable energy supply is to continue expanding oil and gas. So these are just some of the more insidious ways in which the fossil fuel sector really promotes their messaging to young children through something like as innocuous as a video game. There's also an initiative by Shell to do a collaboration with Fortnite. I'm not a video game player, but I understand that's very popular. And this was really about kind of talking about how oil and gas really needs to be the powering behind road trips. And it was really about, the thrill of a road trip and driving through town, and that could only be done on a Shell powered gas car. So yeah, these are just some of the more insidious ways in which just even outside of the classroom, the fossil fuel sector has influence on children. Back to you, Travis.
Thanks, Lexis. So some really good examples, I think, from outside schools, as well as the bigger picture that Anne provided. And of course, as Anne said, there has always been a focus on school-age children and our curriculum. So let's get into some examples from those. So this is an example from the United States, and it's from The Guardian. It's from 2017, but it's looking at the Oklahoma Oil and Natural Gas Board's curriculum materials, which you can still visit at that link down there. And they have several books about a very lovely looking character called Petro Pete. And a lot of them are about his big bad days or his big bad dreams as he wakes up and oil is no longer available. So you end up following Petro Pete through his day as he can't brush his teeth, he can't drive to school, he can't walk anywhere, he can't cook some of his food. And just really the oil companies trying to frame oil as this necessary thing in contemporary life. But of course, we know that doesn't need to be true. If we shift over to Canada, we have a story from the Walrus in 2022 about FortisBC. This is an energy company in the Canadian province of British Columbia, where they make curriculum materials heralding clean natural gas without talking about the need for decarbonization. They also urge students to track their personal use while ignoring the company's focus on profit margins. So they seem to suggest that if 100 students just shorten their showers, they could make a meaningful difference in light of our current carbon budgets. Not to be outdone, we have a report, this is actually referencing a report that Anne wrote in our CBC, so the Canadian Broadcasting Company, where we have Saskatchewan Power, which is another energy producer in Canada, producing curriculum materials, again, celebrating natural gas as clean without discussing decarbonization. And then there's a really, really lovely piece, I think quite early for its time, from Stuart Tannick from UCL, talking about the BP's energy curriculum. They have a really, really nice nugget in there that says you can't get to nature without gasoline or cars. So these are some sophisticated climate obstruction tactics that fossil fuel industries are using to delay and deny climate action, and specifically with our youth. And they are well documented in literature. So what we're going to do now is take you through some of these features based on how Anne, Alexis, and I have kind of synthesized them. So of note, these are definitely drawn from two publications. So one at the top there is coming out sometime this month that I wrote in geography, and then another one is from a more comprehensive report that Anne wrote called Polluting Education. So we're going to go through each of these, talk about it, talk about what you might be on the lookout for, why it's harmful, and then we'll give you a little bit of time to reflect before we get into those breakout groups. So over to you, Anne.
Okay, thanks, Travis. Okay, so this is really the big one, the removal of any reference to politics and power, and especially corporate power. So we see this across the board. So as defined by Emily Eaton and Nick Day, they were the scholars who coined the term petropedagogy. That petropedagogy messaging works by insulating fossil fuel industries from criticism and dissuading young people from questioning or understanding the role of corporate power in the climate crisis. So it's by framing climate change primarily as technical, scientific, a lifestyle issue. Students are discouraged from considering corporate power, political obstruction, economic systems, structural inequality, and climate impacts, the whole shebang. And certainly the history of the fossil fuel industry's own influence campaign, The fact, for instance, that just 57 companies account for 80% of the world's CO2 emissions in the last 6 years at least. The fact that these companies are lobbying hard to block and delay climate action, and the fact of the impacts of fossil fuel-driven climate change on human health and ecosystems. These facts are all off-screen, out of the picture, and the frame is narrowed. Next slide, please. So what we see is this narrowing of the frame. So the science gets to be focused on how and not who benefits. So students, for example, might learn about emissions and the greenhouse gas effect, but not which corporations are driving emissions, nor about why these corporations are continuing to expand fossil fuel production despite our accelerating climate crisis. Extraction might be presented as a neutral technical process. Students, for instance, might study the mechanics of fracking, but not how fracking affects waterways or ecosystems or the health of people near those fracking sites, which is actually significantly impacted, and nor, of course, the climate damaging effects of methane leaks. Issues will be presented as complex rather than with moral clarity. So students might be presented with a fossil fuel project case study that emphasizes the complexity of looking at the issue from multiple viewpoints, while sidelining the fact that the continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels is driving climate change, and that's the biggest global threat facing humanity. So that part is off the frame, out of the picture. So missing in all of this is any discussion of capitalism, the prioritizing of profit, the work of the industry as it continues to lobby our governments to block climate policies and delay the energy transition. Missing is any reference to colonialism, the continued domination and dispossession of Indigenous peoples for the purpose of continued resource extraction. And missing or foreclosed are opportunities to ask important questions like who profits, who's blocking policy, who decides, and we might add who is also pushing back and how. And all of this serves to make power invisible. So students can't understand why we're in this crisis, despite the fact that the science on this issue has been clear for years. It produces them as passive citizens. So students might learn how carbon capture works, but not who decided to fund it instead of renewables, nor for example, how popular support for renewable energy in other jurisdictions might lead to different outcomes. And all of this serves to just naturalize systems. Students are encouraged to simply accept capitalism and corporate power as unchangeable, the world as it is, rather than understanding how this world was built, how it might be rebuilt, how it might be changed, and how it is being rebuilt in communities, in other jurisdictions, in other places. And so giving students a sense that this is unchangeable by removing any reference to how power is working, this is exactly what fossil fuel companies want, so that they can continue operating and can continue profiting. So with that, I will now pass to Alexis. Over to you.
Thanks so much. And as we go through, just to, if you have a pen and paper next to you, or even on your notepad, just to think about where you're seeing some of these features showing up in your teaching, or even in just your day-to-day life, seeing the kind of influences of petropedagogy in these 5 steps. And yeah, it'd be great to hear that as we go into the breakouts as well. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the next feature of petropedagogy is really this idea of treating industry as helpful partners. And I would even go so far as to say sometimes industry are treated as the most important partners in the rooms, the only ones who can really deliver the transition with the skills and expertise to actually deliver it. When in fact, as Anne outlined so brilliantly in the beginning part of the presentation, they have been at the kind of head of climate obstruction and denial and delay for several decades now. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So how does this show up really? It really looks at fossil fuel companies presented as necessary stakeholders for the transition, as innovators who, if you only give them enough time or agency, will eventually find themselves to innovating for a green future, or even educational partners who should be invited onto campus for recruitment, to be a part of conversations in culture as well. The image in the bottom left-hand corner is actually from the British Museum in London, which has had an ongoing partnership with BP that has been much to the chagrin of activists in the area who have consistently advocated that the British Museum drop their partnership with BP. The Winter Olympics this year in Milan are sponsored by Eni, the Italian oil and gas company. Which is also ironic given the fact that the Olympics every single year have become, the Winter Olympics in particular, have become harder and harder to host each season because of the disappearing snow. And on the top, we've had a discussion on university campuses about whether or not it's appropriate to invite fossil fuel companies for recruitment on campus. And in the context of a university, it's really been exactly symptomatic of what Anne was just speaking about, which is that engineering departments or geology departments are recruiting for these kind of value neutral roles around, understanding seismic activity or looking at, safety assessments, for example, for extraction, without looking at that within the wider lens of power. But really, this kind of feature of petropedagogy is really about this centralization of fossil fuel companies and how their voices are considered to be more important than other stakeholders in the process. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Really what to look for here is having industry reps who are really involved and invited into spaces where there's discussions about transition. On a university or a school campus, this could be inviting them in as guest speakers without this sort of frame of challenging or context, which allows them a platform to basically spread in more climate denial and obstruction without being challenged. Often you can see this show up in the media of balanced perspective. If you're going to have an activist speak, you also have someone from the oil and gas sector. Never mind that there are varying commitments to truth between those two stakeholders. So often you can have an oil and gas rep invited onto the stage, but they're there to toe the company line. They're not there necessarily to be honest about the impacts or what they're doing behind the scenes. We often sometimes see this as well showing up in corporate social responsibility partnerships. So this has shown up time again of partnerships, for example, funding young people to go to the Olympics. Actually, interestingly enough, British Gas was one of the backers of the Paralympic team. So really demonstrating that they have a space to encourage young people's ambitions and goals. And these are the community projects that they're involved in, without talking about the massive hand over fist profits that they were making during the energy crisis while people were literally freezing to death in their homes in the UK. There's also discussions about in partnership language, doing these collaborations that make oil and gas sector or the fossil fuel sector really seem like legitimate and collaborative partners. And then this idea that you also see coming up in media a lot as well, which is that, all stakeholders in the energy transition have valid concerns, but really absent of the kind of very present obstruction and behind the scenes lobbying that's happened. Why is this harmful? Really, sometimes we can often see this kind of conflation of the importance of an energy company surviving being just as important as planetary survival. There's a big discussion about what happens to these firms in the transition. And there are very legitimate concerns about workers and oil and gas workers who need a fair and just transition. But the energy bosses who are making unreal profits every single year and paid out millions of dollars in bonuses are not really the ones to be in the room kind of putting false equivalents between their survival and planetary survival. There's also a discussion about whose voice matters. So we often see that energy companies are the first to be kind of invited into spaces when talking about transition, and not the communities that they have affected. And there's actually very often no recognition of the damage done to their communities. I recommend, just as a pedagogical tool, there's something called the People's Health Tribunal that was put together in the Niger Delta, which was basically the first time that people got to give their testimonies of the damage that Shell did to the Niger Delta and the really genuine long-term, lifelong impacts on health from Shell's mismanagement in the Niger Delta. So we have done, for example, a screening of that People's Health Tribunal here, and that's something that you can also do in your institutions as well. And yeah, it just the equivalence made here is it's like inviting a tobacco boss to teach your health class. There's really when we treat industry as helpful partners or as neutral partners even, without challenging them on their involvement in the climate crisis, we really ignore the decades that they've spent blocking climate action. So with that, I'll hand back. Oh yes, and just to say again, to put a a little thoughts about what this is resonating for you, and if you've seen this come up before. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexis. So the next feature that we see coming up repeatedly is this idea that fossil fuels are unequivocally and absolutely necessary to modern life. So it reinforces this notion that, the fossil fuel dependent world in which we live is given and unchangeable, and indeed that change is undesirable. So next slide, please. So this message is kind of powerful because it really taps into students' everyday material life and experience. The problem with it is that it conflates dependence with inherent necessity. It makes our current dependence on fossil fuels seem inevitable, necessary, and it does that in order to maintain that dependence on fossil fuels and prevent us from envisioning alternatives. So next slide, please. And you can see this here in that, the previous one, of all of the ways in which, this, the Canadian oil and gas industry is saying, you could not live without us. All of these products here, you absolutely need us for. You cannot move ever away from us. So yeah, next slide, thanks. So where is this showing up? It's showing up in Imagine Life Without Oil activities and in messaging, such as the messaging that we just saw, in those, how do we get to the grocery stores? How would we cook our food? The kind of Petro Pete example that Travis was referring to before. It shows up in lessons or messages that highlight the everyday use of products that contain hydrocarbons. Again, as we just saw, toothbrushes, furniture, makeup, clothes, medical equipment. Without fossil fuels, how would we brush our teeth, furnish our homes, clothe ourselves, etc.? The idea of life without fossil fuel products is presented as unimaginable. It shows up repeatedly in narratives that emphasize our economic dependency on fossil fuels. You cannot do without us. And certainly here in Canada, where I am, the fossil fuel industry is represented as absolutely critical to our economy. And there was a story recently of a researcher who visited one of the top business schools here in Canada and asked the students there, the best and the brightest at the end of their business degrees, what percentage does Canada's oil and gas business contribute to our GDP? And most responded by guessing between 50 to 70% of Canada's GDP is dependent on fossil fuels. And the real answer, they were shocked to learn, was 7.8%. So this gross inflation of the importance of the oil and gas industry is certainly integral to Canada, the Canadian version of the fossil fuels are absolutely necessary argument. The other side to this kind of messaging is the representation of renewable energy as inadequate and intermittent. And certainly we often hear this here, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. Whereas in fact, we know that renewables plus storage and energy efficiency measures are fast now outpacing fossil fuels and are cheaper, cleaner, faster to install, better for our health, better for our communities. But fossil fuel necessity messaging obscures all of this. It presents the world to us in terms of this is how the world works, and this is how, this is how the world works, and not this is how it was built. It obscures the fact that there were alternatives in the past that were either not pursued or were actively blocked. For instance, oil and gas companies were told that they could invest massively in renewable energy to avert the threat of climate breakdown, but they didn't. It also forecloses our imagination of alternative futures, the possibility that things might be different, that we might make it so, and indeed that it is being made so in other places, and even within our own communities, but on smaller scales. And so through all of this, the fossil fuel necessity argument treats climate devastation and climate impacts, the destruction of ecosystems and human lives and livelihoods, as either unavoidable or somehow even perhaps like unimaginably as like a necessary evil, but without ever in a way fully acknowledging that that's the price of continued fossil fuel dependence. So it's a powerful message, and we see it everywhere, and it absolutely we have to think about ways to contest that. And now I will pass. Actually, again, an opportunity to jot down, like if this is resonating with you, do you see it in your day-to-day or in your classrooms? And then on to Travis.
Thanks, Anne. So for this fourth feature, we are now looking at technological advancements being pushed over systems change. So the way we can kind of define this, there's this argument that most of our environmental problems can be solved through some form of better technology or some corporate innovation, and approaches that really tend not to challenge the fossil fuel production or economic system. So a good example of this is the hype around carbon capture and storage, and specifically the idea of putting more and more carbon capture and storage near oil and gas production areas. The first point here is that carbon capture and storage is still yet to be proven at scale. I've seen some very interesting calculations by professors that I've worked with that if we were to try to keep the amount of carbon we need at central, or even start to decrease, we would need a carbon capture and storage device about the size of a school bus every 20 meters, running 24/7 across the entire globe. So not proven at scale yet. But secondly, most of the carbon and capture storage has actually been used for something called enhanced oil recovery. And that's what that first little diagram there shows. So this is where the carbon byproducts are captured, but they're actually pumped back into the earth to get more oil out. And as you can see from the graph on the right, most of the carbon captured to date has actually been used to ramp up production to not slow it down. So for these types of examples, we're looking for curriculum materials that really try to tout carbon capture and storage as the main solution. We have this focus on always making things more efficient. In that Saskatchewan Power example, there was ideas of putting carbon capture and storage on existing coal plants to make them more efficient and to make them more clean. There's ideas about talking about being responsible, but that responsible and that regulation is really being more responsible to increased production. These can also show up in innovation showcases and the idea that we need to balance the economy and the environment. Now, of course, these are harmful because we delay the transition while promising future fixes. So again, this is kind of like that Band-Aid approach. How long can we keep pushing this can down the road? It relies on technology that's still not proven at scale. And of course, as Anne was talking about, this diverts funds away from actual renewable sources. And then, as we said before, this is kind of like improving the fuel efficiency of a bus as we drive it off a cliff, right? So we're really just trying to improve that dying system instead of moving away from something altogether. Okay. So I invite you to take a second here, as we did before. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. Cool. Note. This can appear anti-technology. And I want to be really careful here that, on the contrary, the goal isn't to eliminate all discussions of tech. And I think that's come up in my classes before. Here, we're saying that renewable energy infrastructure, battery storage, and heat pumps are still essential for the transition, but we need to get better and help our students to distinguish between technological advances that enable fossil fuel continuation and ones that enable a genuine transition away from these fuels, okay? So I do invite you to take a second, jot down some initial thoughts about this feature, right? What resonates with you? Do you see it in your day-to-day? Do you see it in some of your classes? And the last one. So the last one is about personal actions as a primary solution. So this is the idea and this argument that climate change is going to be primarily caused by the sum of individual choices. And that's how solutions are going to be focused on personal behaviors rather than challenging corporate production or policy initiatives. And as someone who's taught in classrooms for a number of years, this one particularly irks me. So this is an example from the BC Lions. So this is a British Columbia pro football team, but it's American football. And they have this series called Energy Champions, which of course is funded by FortisBC, a large energy company in British Columbia. And they have BC Lions players come to your school and they will give you presentations. And a focus in these presentations is that ways how we can save energy at the home. Now, I've had my grade 6 students come up to me after such presentations, and I'm really, really torn when they do because they seem quite disheartened after presentations such as this. Now, on one side, individual actions are really important, right? They can help us inspire others. They can make you feel good like you're doing your part. They can build a grassroots movement. They can get a school to do some really important things. But with young people, and especially how much they care about different issues, they can sometimes see this as the only way that they can help. And they're really burdened by thinking this is their fault. So I've had students come to me in grade 6 crying because they didn't know how they could take any shorter showers. And it was up to me to talk about how no amount of shorter showers are actually going to make up for increased corporate production. So things to look out for in this example, of course, is this idea of a carbon footprint. I do believe this was a BP propaganda strategy from the early 2000s. Anne's nodding her head. So the oil companies created this metric that we now widely use. They really try to focus on what can you do, giving you energy efficiency kits, conservation competitions. In my own hometown here in Canada, we've had energy companies do tree planting drives, right? So this idea of you focusing on something. And the problem with this is it shifts the blame. So this there's a nice study that's linked there that shows that, I think as Anne talked about before, but 71% of emissions since 1988 have been caused by only 100 companies. And what this tactic does is it pushes the blame onto individuals and especially our children. And this induces guilt and saying that like you need to do a little bit more in your individual way. And we don't need to do something on our end. Creating climate anxiety, well, of course, these companies get to profit. And in truth, this is victim blaming. Right? So it implies those that suffer most, like our friends in the global south or of lower income, can solve this problem through individuals when they have contributed least and when they have the least amount of power to actually make a choice about what to do about it. And that gets a little bit into some justice framing, which we'll talk about in our breakout groups. So for that last petropedagogy feature, again, jot down some initial thoughts about it. What resonates with you? Do you see it in your day-to-day, in your classes? And we're going to get to talk about that in a second in our breakout groups. Okay. So what we're going to do now. Thanks, Lexi. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I believe. So for the student side group, our group looked at this website that's in the chat. It just highlights some of the features of petropedagogy and then gives some fictitious curriculum resources. And then highlights an actual answer key to some of them. So those can be a good way to think to yourself how you might be seeing this, or even a good way to do that lesson with your class, but try to adapt it in a way that would identify some of those features and move stuff forward. Okay. Awesome. So I just wanted, in the last kind of 9 minutes, I just welcome any perspectives from the breakout groups before we wrap up here.
I'll maybe just give a quick outline of what we were doing in the student group, which was basically just going through an exercise on pulling a few ads and then basically chatting through how and why they have been labeled as greenwash, using kind of 3 different pillars of omission, denial, and kind of political spin, basically. And so, yeah, I'll put the resources in the chat, but we had some, interesting discussions in our group.
One of the takeaways for me from our from the teacher group was, which I hadn't thought of before, was thinking about life without fossil fuels. Obviously, there's the kind of the material, you know, you're worse off, you don't have all of that physical equipment that we saw on that slide, but that the framing of the drama activity as it creates conflict and further polarizes. So this idea that life without fossil fuels necessarily leads to a more polarized society or leads to more conflict, which is something I hadn't considered before.
Interesting. Thanks, Lachlan. That's a really good point. And then I think as someone else in our group, how can we try to diffuse that conflict, right? And still try to find some of that common ground. Yeah. Adriana.
I think that there is one limitation I find quite difficult in the classroom. So there is very little space for the students to be critical of what they receive as the truth. So when they open the books, they don't feel very comfortable in criticizing or in challenging those ideas. And I think it depends on teachers to be able to challenge the ideas. But for that, we need to be critical ourselves. So I think that's a challenge for the educators to introduce an element of point of view and, in the classroom. So when they open a website or a book or a leaflet, or when they receive a lecture, a visitor, they can be a risk taker, really, and voice what they feel rather than just taking it as it is, as the truth.
Thanks, Adriana. That reminds me of there's our curriculum and what we're teaching, and there's the hidden curriculum, which is what the curriculum's not saying. Right? I think it's always trying to be careful that we have or try to be able to try to show both of those to students and ourselves.
And I think just on the back of Adriana's point there, it's also not necessarily about them needing to question every single thing, but just having the reflex to ask the question, who wrote this and why? Or like, who has done this and why? And even if that answer, and that answer doesn't always have to be the fossil fuel industry for reasons of conspiracy. It could just be, thinking more critically about the information they're receiving in lots of different spaces, which I think is also a good tool for looking at kind of being a good engaged political citizen as well. But I think just getting them to ask the question, who has done this and why?
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, I mean, when I was sort of preparing for this webinar and looking at the tobacco industry ads, like I do wonder about starting with that. Like you see them and it's like, oh, I can't even believe that they used to disseminate these messages, because oh my gosh, everyone knows that smoking cigarettes causes cancer, and we've seen government action on this. So you automatically have a critical framework set up to look at those ads now. So what would it be like to imagine such a critical framework looking at fossil fuel messaging? That might be an interesting way into developing those sort of critical capacity there.
Yeah, that's great. And I see Meryl giving us some great resources in the chat as well about some of this stuff. That's great. Yeah, Joanne?
Yes. Hi. I'm hoping you might be able to share those resources in on email afterwards as well, if that's possible, please. But my other thought was, I find that it's sort of what else. I think this is brilliant, and it just changes that dynamic, because we've always so often been saying, you know, this is what you could do as a school, or this is what you can do as a young person, or in fact anybody. And it's shifting that slightly away, saying actually the responsibility is bigger, but there's still this. I feel like there's still needs to be something of what you can do, what an individual can do, what a young person can do, as recognizing that it's all their small actions all add up, obviously, as we've always said, but it's bigger than that. And then what? Do you see what I mean? Then what do they still do about that? Once acknowledging that this has been a deliberate campaign for many years, and it still is, what can they do about that? Do you see what I mean?
I do. I think, Alexis, I saw you nodding your head a lot. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's so interesting, because I feel like it's so disempowering to just be told, like, this is what's happening, and you know, there's these massive powers that have more control. I do think that partly one of the things, I run a kind of youth empowerment program that's slightly older. It's usually kind of 21 to 25 is like our biggest cohort. But one of the things that's been really interesting is that we partnered with a coalition of youth activists to run it. And actually what they were saying was, what was most inspiring was not only the content and the information about what can be done, but the fact that it was delivered by young people. So I also wonder if it's not only about telling them what they can do, it's showing them the young people who are already leading on campaigning or on initiatives, or, you know, school strikes, etc., and basically showing them not only the actions, but really like the leaders who are similar ages to them, because we actually have such a massive amount of young people who are as young as kind of 9 who are really leading quite big campaigns. So I can find some resources and put them together on youth leaders. But yeah.
Great. Adriana, I do see you, but I do want to respect everybody's time. So it's okay if you want to hang out at the end there. Perfect. So just to kind of wrap up, the Oxford Education Deanery Sustainability Team, who's put on a lot of these webinars in the past, we're having a residential this June, from June 11th to 13th. There is financial aid available. You can register down at that link. It promises to be a really, really great time thinking about how can we dig into these topics a little bit more, hear from world-leading experts about things even past petropedagogy, to include mental health, to include climate, education frameworks, and we'll actually hopefully come out with some actually curriculum materials. So if you are interested in that, the registration link is right there, and please share widely. We also have an upcoming webinar by our own indefatigable Kim Polgreen about using school grounds to support curriculum learning and skill development in secondary schools. This will be in person in Oxfordshire. It's always a very popular experience with our resident nature experts. So please take a look at that here if you'd like to. We have one more at the end of February about gamifying climate change education. I don't know as much as I want to about this one, but this seems like a really, really cool initiative as well. I think led by Bill Finnegan. And then that was us. So we will be sending out an email at the end of this with some of those links to our future offerings. I believe we usually have a short survey about how this webinar went. We're always interested in improving. And we will, of course, compile this great list of resources, as well as the ones that we've shared in this webinar, and send that to you. If you want to stick around for a little bit, we'll stop the recording. If you have somewhere to go, thank you very, very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future events that we offer.
Thanks very much, everyone.